Okay. Today is Monday, February 21st, 2000, and it's my pleasure to be with Deborah Bernini, a 1981 graduate of the University of Arizona College of Law. For the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law, my name is Vicki Fleischer, and I'm here to ask Judge Bernini a few questions. Thank you for being with us.
Sure.
Judge Bernini, can you tell us how you decided to go to law school in the first place?
Well, actually, it was a second choice. I had actually wanted to go to med school, but I didn't have the patience. And when I looked into careers that would give me a say and, I guess, decision making and things that I thought that I would be able to do pretty well, although I thought I would enjoy medicine, I never thought that I could handle all those years of training before I could actually go out and do a job.
Mm-hmm.
Law school is just something else that I guess came to me when I was in even high school, and from that point on, that's what I wanted to do.
Great. And why did you pick Arizona?
I picked Arizona because my father was stationed at Fort Huachuca probably in the mid-50s, and he had this sketchbook in his closet of cactus. And I grew up in a steel town north of Philadelphia, and my entire life I was focused on this alleyway out a window looking at a fire escape. And this picture of a cactus just stood with me. And I had a chance to go somewhere else, but Tucson was where I wanted to come. So that's where I ended up.
Great. How difficult was it to get into law school at that time?
It must not have been that difficult because I certainly got in, and I wasn't a resident. I came here, probably applied to maybe 3 law schools, and I really didn't give it as much thought. Looking back on it now, I probably should have done a whole lot more, and it was more luck than anything else, and I'm very happy about that.
I think that's pretty common, actually. It sounds familiar to my experience.
Yeah.
How many students were in your class when you started?
I don't remember the exact number. I know it was approximately 120, 130, somewhere around that. We were a third women.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's up from some other people we've talked to who went to school
it
before
had,
you.
It had really started to change. The year that I entered law school, there were very significant differences from the class even before us. So things had started to change pretty dramatically.
Did most of your classmates graduate with you?
Except for maybe 8 or 9, the class graduated. There were very few people that didn't make it all the way through or chose not to make it all the way through.
Can you guess at least a range of the average age of students at the time that you went to school?
We actually had a lot of older students, so much so that if you just did an average, the average age for our class was in the late 30s. We had a number of students who had had other careers and came back. Those were the folks that absolutely did the best. They had a life. They didn't just do college and kind of cram their way through law school, and then here they were, these newbies that didn't know anything about life. We had a lot of people with first and even second careers who then decided to go to law school, and it was unusual in our class. We were different for that reason also.
Were most of your classmates from Arizona?
Most of them were from Arizona. We had the usual large cadre from Nevada because they didn't have their own law school at the time. And a smattering of students from back east, but I would say probably more than half were from Tucson, or at least from the Arizona area.
Okay. Were you involved with the law review when you were in law school?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. How about summer school?
Yes.
Okay, tell
Yes.
me about that.
Well, my goal had always been to get through school as fast as possible. Again, going back to why I couldn't make it through med school. So I did my undergrad in 3 years, and then took a year off to try to regroup and get money again. And then I wanted to get through law school as fast as I could. And actually, it didn't shorten the amount of time that I was in law school, but summer sessions it was a way to get some classes done so that your load wasn't as tough or as hard, because I was working full-time all the way through law school. Which, well, that's a whole other story. It involves some fraud and a couple of lies, but that started very early on in my career here at the U of A. But summer school was also, there was this feeling that law school that would be easier in the summer. I have no idea why we thought this, but we thought that if we came in the summer with the heat around here, nobody could possibly be taking this seriously. Well, unfortunately, a few of them did, and that was always a problem. But it was a good way to get some of the courses out of the way, like community property. I think I did trial practice in the summer. The kinds of things that were not your core classes, but it was a good way to just make the rest of the semester, the rest of the year just go a lot more smoothly.
Were there any clinical programs when you were in law school?
No.
What type of student activities were there?
I'm not sure that had there been student activities then, I would even have known what they were, because I really I had this sort of split schizophrenic life where I was working more even than I was even attending class. I was one of those students the professors just despised because I was always worried about getting a project in for someone downtown, a lawyer that I was working for. They wanted me to be in class paying attention to them, and I just didn't think that was the most fruitful way to spend my time. So if there were any activities, I wasn't partaking of them. The only thing that I know started up because it caused such a furor when I was in law school is the Law Men's Association. And that started up when I was, I'm trying to remember if it started the second year or if it was the third year. Because my memories of the Law Men's Association and the clash between some of the female students and the men who wanted to start this up really are from this building. And we weren't in this building until the very last semester of our third year. And it was really a clash. There were arguments in the hall. Somebody got slapped. I mean, it was just a mess. The Law Men's Association did not get off to a very smooth start with the women students when it first got started. I don't know how the association is perceived now, but at that time it was perceived as this men's only club, and we couldn't understand how any enlightened person would want to start up this men's only organization.
It doesn't exist now,
It doesn't
I'll tell
exist
you that.
anymore.
Yeah. There's a law women's association now that anyone can join.
Oh, that's
So
good to hear.
maybe that came out as a result of this, it sounds like. Was there any faculty-student interaction outside the classroom that you were aware of?
The kind you would approve of?
Yes. Let's not go to the other direction.
Yes, there was. In fact, there were a number of professors here that went out of their way to meet with us at Gentle Ben's, to interact with us outside of law school. I think that they started up, again, I can't remember now if it was my second or third year, but we had that long literature where there were professors and there were students, and we'd get together with like the English professors from the college. And that was really something that a lot of people look forward to, and it was very different from the law school experience, and it was that kind of interaction and the professors that were willing to do that, people really, really enjoyed.
Who were they, the professors, remember?
Well, it was the usual, it was Kenny Hegland, it was Andy Silverman, I think who else? Because those are the two that still to this day do it. I mean, that just hasn't changed in, 20 years? I'm trying to think who else. There are a few. Wexler would get involved sometimes, and I know Professor Wexler's still here. But those were the main crew that were willing to get involved with the students afterwards. Mike Sacken, who was the associate dean, and went under the dean back then, was very, very involved with students. And in fact, even allowed us to use his house sometimes for get-togethers and parties. He was a pretty terrific guy.
Sounds like it. Where did most law students live?
Most of them lived in incredibly dungy, cheap apartments very close to school. There were the married students that were, living in some of the cheap housing that was available over near the med school. Most of us lived within walking or biking distance of the law school. I had a very close friend in law school named Sue Brunsting. And Sue lived way out in the foothills and drove in every day in a Mercedes. And she was definitely the exception to our law school class.
What were the job prospects like when you graduated?
We thought they were pretty good. Looking back on it, I'm not so sure that they were as good as we thought. Maybe we were a little bit too optimistic. There weren't as many of the high-paying jobs that there are now available. Frankly, the law school didn't have the reputation back then that it has now. So a lot of us were interested in going into government service, government work, and there were lots of those jobs to be had. There weren't very many students that didn't have jobs when it was time to take the bar exam. And there was the usual private practice type offers. But there was such a large group that was willing to go into the government work, and those jobs were the ones that a lot of people just drifted towards.
What was the bar exam like?
I was the only person I remember smiling through the bar exam, but again, that has a lot to do with, there's something a little off about me. When it was time to study for the bar exam, I was driving a van load of pre-teenaged girls around the United States so that they could participate in the Junior Olympics. I was not studying for the bar exam. Then when I got back, I was house sitting at a very, very nice home at the pool for one of the professors here. So I was the only one that showed up smiling and tan. You could also say showed up probably just oblivious to what was about to hit. But I know that people were very stressed out about it, that they were taking any course they could, and there's a lot more courses available now. But there was the usual bar brie, and then they came out with a new course, and I should remember that because I actually purchased the materials to take with me on this 2-week-long camping trip. But it was a second course that came out. And it was just the way it was like first year, where everyone's buying every canned outline they can get their hands on. Not knowing why, but they noticed somebody else was doing it, so they had to do it too. So people were they were buying old outlines. They were buying outlines that people had written on. They were getting new ones, so they'd have something fresh to look at. And people were just freaking out about the bar exam. And then the bar exam itself was just exhausting. It was 3 days back then. We had 2 days of essays and then the 1 day of the multiple choice. And when it was all done, there was no feeling of relief. It was just, you were still waiting, and it wasn't just a matter of waiting to see if you passed or not. It just didn't have that kind of closure that you thought you were going to have. A lot of us had planned big parties, and I know I ended up going home and sleeping for like 18 hours straight. And I think a lot of people, the same thing happened.
So tell me about some of your classmates, and if you know where they have gone to since law school, we'd be interested.
One of the things that's most telling about my law school class and how we perceived ourselves would be to look at our 10-year reunion. When it was time for the 10-year reunion, there was the reunion that was being put on by whoever those people are that stay involved. There's always someone willing to, do all that work. And yeah, we appreciate it, but it's like, why would you want to do that? And then we're all grateful that they did. So there was the regular one going on. And then there was this small cadre of folks that most of them had been in my small section. And they were the ones who, when we sat down and looked at each other over dinner, because we didn't go to the regular reunion, everyone had turned out to be either a public defender or gone into criminal defense. It was the socialists of our law school class. The class before us was still perceived as being somewhat liberal, the type of lawyers that, it was long past the 60s, but there was still a group that always existed in every law school class that was measurable, of people who wanted to go out, and it wasn't just what they wrote in their essay to get into law school. They really believed that they were going to go out and write social injustice and do all these great things. Our class had a very, very small group, so much so that we thought that our class was sort of the death of that type of student. There was a very small group that actually felt that way, and so they hung out together. And again, it was interesting at the reunion to see that we got together apart from everybody else, and that what everybody had gone on to do was so similar. Handling death penalty cases, and one of them had gone off to become a psychologist, but that's sort of like being a public defender. So that was just really telling. We had a lot of practical jokers in our class. We had some really fun people. We have a horrible story from my first year class, but I mean horrible funny, and for people who are now lawyers, the statute of limitations has passed, but we had Joe Livermore for our criminal section, and he was great. I mean, he certainly knew what he was doing. He went on to great things, and I know he's back here. But we were in the old building, and in the old building they had these clocks that literally, it was like being in high school or junior high, where just a minute before the bell, we had bells, it would click loudly so that you knew that the bell's coming, it was time to leave and go on to your next class. And Joe was a chain smoker and a very kind of nervous, energy kind of guy. And as soon as the click would hit, Joe would light up his cigarette because he knew the class was over and he'd been putting up with us and not smoking for the entire length of the class. And so that was the whole semester, and we'd laugh about it. When it was our last class, and we were first years, we decided that it would be hysterical to do the following. We hand-rolled cigarettes for every student in the class, but one of them was a marijuana joint. And we put them down, and it was a lottery. And you just had to put your hand in and take out whatever it was. And when it was the very end of the last class and the click went off, we were all going to light up and lean back the way he did and just see what Joe's reaction was going to be. And so we did it. And I wasn't the person to win the lottery, somebody else, but you could smell it in class, and Joe could smell it. So first he's hit by all these people leaning back, mimicking him and smoking. But then the odor of the marijuana hits. And he went like 4 shades of red. I didn't know there were that many shades of red. And he just looked at us and he froze and then he ran out of the room and we sat there laughing, thinking this was the funniest thing. And then as we're leaving the classroom, we're going, well, oh shit, are we going to get in trouble for this? But nobody had thought of that beforehand. And that was my small section, most of which are the ones that showed up as public defenders, criminal defense, and that lonely psychologist. But it was a great group of folks.
Sounds like it was a good group of
They were
folks.
great.
Who was your small section teacher?
It was lonely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great. Tell me, in the lecture halls, how many students would usually be in there with you?
A little over 100. The class was broken into thirds, and most of the large lectures were at least 2/3. Some of them we had the entire class. We were crammed into a lecture hall that existed in the old building, and it held a lot of people. You know, so we all had airs, and the property sections were usually pretty large, but those were always 2/3 of the class, and those were all held in a giant lecture hall. Some of those classes, though, were just so packed with people, especially in the old facility, that I know for a fact that people were sitting in the back row eating and drinking and talking about things that had nothing to do with class. You couldn't even see in the front, much different than the setup that's here.
What were some of the subjects that were taught that you enjoyed?
My favorite class was trial practice, but that had as much to do with the fact that that's where I knew I wanted to go, and that was something that was very different and more practical than the core courses that I had to take all along. And I didn't realize then, but what I was really hungering for was some sort of clinical program that we didn't have. So that's why that class was my favorite. Criminal law was a hoot. I mean, Wexler was very, very funny. He had that dry delivery, but he was talking about things regarding bananas and chickens and things that you never talk about in polite company, and we could just sit here and laugh about it. So that was always a fun class. I really enjoyed Wexler's class. And and there were others. There were moments, but in terms of whole classes, those were the only two that really come to mind.
How many classes did the average student take per semester?
Probably 5. Some would take more, some would take less. But 4 or 5 was the average.
What were the reading assignments like then?
I remember for some of the classes, the reading assignments were just horrendous. And for others, it seemed like, shouldn't we be doing more? There was always a lot in property and water law, and some of these classes just had to go on and on and on. Con law, there was always a lot of reading. There were students that would be at the library all night long just trying to get these reading assignments done, and then some of us were fortunate that just sort of some gift from God, we just read real fast, we're able to get through it a lot more quickly.
Were papers required in any of your courses?
The only required paper was the substantial paper that you had to turn in to graduate. And then we had Professor Cherry, who was the librarian then, who was just this lovely guy, and we had papers that we had to turn in when we were learning research and writing for him. Those are the only classes I remember required papers. There wasn't very much writing, which is unfortunate, because I had been working since my first year as a law clerk downtown to a couple of lawyers, And my writing skills were horrible. And I wrote well. I mean, I knew how to write essays. I was a history major. I mean, writing wasn't a problem for me. It was legal writing that I didn't know how to do. And I just sort of taught myself the hard way. Working downtown, it was something that I wished I'd learned a little bit more here.
What were the exams like in law school?
Really long. Nobody had computers back then, so it was very quiet. You didn't hear the touch of the keyboards. A couple of students actually typed them, and there was a typing room set aside, but it was just blue book after blue book after blue book. Very quiet. Every once in a while, you'd hear somebody all frustrated, balling something up and tossing it at the wall, and you just keep writing and writing.
So they were all essay exams for the most part?
Yes.
Yeah. Were there any oral examinations or all written?
Professor Kozolchek had offered in his UCC class an option. You could do an oral exam with him. You could do a take-home exam that he threatened was harder than any test you had ever taken, or you could do an in-class test. And a lot of us actually chose the oral exam thinking, oh, come on, how bad could this be? And it seemed like a lot less work than having to sit there and write everything out. That was the only class that I remember there being an oral exam being offered.
What was it like, the exam? Was it hard?
Well, it was different. For anyone who's ever had to sit through, their PhD, the oral grilling that you get for that sort of thing, it wasn't as bad as that. I mean, Professor Kozolchek's just too nice a man, but it was so different. It was something that maybe more of them should have tried, because there was that not knowing what's coming and then having to produce right away, not really getting time to think and write or come back to it later. If you didn't know what he was getting at, you had to do it right away. It was kind of interesting. But he was so nice too, though. You could read his body language. I mean, in many ways, even though it was maybe more difficult on some aspects than a written test, in many ways, if you could read someone, it was almost easier, because you can almost see Professor Kozolchek kind of like feeling, oh, you're going the wrong way, so you would kind of take it somewhere else, and then you'd be okay. But it was all right.
Sounds like it'd be a good experience for someone who's going to go into trial practice.
Yes, yes.
What was the predominant teaching technique when you were in school? Was there a lot of Socratic method then?
There was a lot of Socratic method. And I think I was a third year before I figured out what in God's name the Socratic method was. But there was lots of that going on.
Yeah. Tell me about the graduation ceremony.
We had two ceremonies. We had just the law school ceremony in the Gallagher Theater. And you were given 2 tickets because there wasn't enough space for everybody. And that was just for us. And then if you wanted to walk through the cap and gown, and they had it over at, I'm blanking on it, not Bear Down. Where do we have our basketball games? McHale. So that was the big one if you wanted to actually do the cap and gown ceremony. The one that we had was at Gallagher was actually made, it was special, especially because what Mike Sacken did, and this is one of the funniest things that I have ever listened to in my life. Mike Sacken, again, was the associate dean. And what Mike had done was gone back and gotten all of our applications to get into law school. And he had pulled from them, he couldn't read from all the students who were there, but a pretty large sampling of what we had said as to why we wanted to go to law school and why we wanted to become lawyers. And you have never heard that much drivel being read off at one time in one room, and people were hysterical. In a way, it was sort of sad, because so much of what those people said, if they meant it, had fallen to the wayside. But most of it was, you knew that they didn't mean a word of it when they wrote it. Those were the funny ones. But it was, about the good works and bettering, everyone's lives. And it was sad and funny all rolled into one. But I remember most of us were laughing until there were tears running down our face. It was pretty funny.
I have a couple questions about the faculty when you were in law school. Do you remember about how many faculty members there were?
No. Tell me how many we have now, do you know?
We have about 27 full-time now.
Boy, I'm thinking it was maybe 12 to 15.
Sounds like it if your lecturers, if you were all in one lecture for a lot of classes?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know if your professors were required to publish the way that they are now?
I don't know what the requirements are, but I doubt it. I think that that's just become more and more important to get tenure, and I don't think that that was, you certainly couldn't tell that that was a big issue. And you know how they have displays all over the law school now with all the books everybody's doing? I don't remember any big displays. There was a small case as you walked in with a few books in it, but if we'd had people publishing the way they had to now, we would have had, you know, cases that go on and on and on, just like they do now.
Yeah. Do you know how one became a law professor back then?
Well, you know, we had an interesting mix back then. We had some people teaching here who were still practitioners. I mean, this was the days of Jack Rappaport. And I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he was teaching 2 or 3 courses here at that time. Then we had a few people here who were literally renowned. We had a professor who was teaching criminal, not criminal law, but criminal rules and procedure. And he wasn't my section professor. I can't remember his name, but I know that he was very, very well known. And after we had him, he ended up going back teaching at school in Midwest. But he was some of those absent-minded, brilliant people. We had Dobbs, you know, who's still renowned. We had some amazing people, and we had some people coming and going in the night who never taught again after they were here for a couple of years. So it was a real mix, and I don't know what they were looking for in their requirements.
Who were some of your favorite professors?
Well, I don't want to slight anyone, so I loved them all. I loved all my professors.
You've graduated, Judge Bernini.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, but you didn't swear me in either.
True. Okay, so let's talk about the dean at the time. What do you remember about Dean Henderson?
I remember that he seemed like a pretty serious guy, but if you ever saw him in another situation, he had a pretty funny and mean wit, but we didn't see a lot of that as students. Everyone, all they would say about him, you know, he did insurance defense, like that would define him for all time. It's like, what did that mean? And most of us didn't even know back then. We just knew that must make him pretty conservative and probably a Republican. And who knows, but that was just the way that we perceived it back then. Not a lot of interaction with him. I had him for class, so I had him for torts. But other than that, I didn't see him very much, and I don't think many of the other students did either.
Tell us a little bit about the transition that the law school went through when it moved from the Franklin building to the building that we're in now. You said it was the last semester of your third year.
It was a disaster. And maybe most moves are, but this was a total disaster. When we were in the old building, there was this expectation that at least by your third year, you would have in the dungeon, which is what we called the old library, your own carrel that you could sleep at if you wanted to. It was open 24 hours a day. You could eat, you could drink. I told you, they were having sex in the back. I mean, it was heaven. And by third year, you had this expectation that you would now be able to reap the benefit of the dungeon. Well, our third year, at the end of the first semester, fall semester, is when they moved into this building. And they closed down the old building, including the dungeon, and this building wasn't open. And so we had no place to go. We were filling Denny's and all these little coffee shops that were open 24 hours a day because we had to have our, constant coffee, and we had to have this like lights and something going on because very few of us studied at home. We were just used to doing this, having this setup. And so they had this building closed. And we were angry, and we complained, and we protested, and it was a nightmare getting ready for finals because this was study week is when they decided to do it, but to no avail. When they opened up this building, everything new and shiny and pretty, And then we were looking at this sign that they were going to have hours, and that we weren't allowed to camp out, and we weren't allowed to eat, and we weren't allowed to drink. And we were robbed, absolutely robbed of what we thought we were entitled to. No, we were entitled to. A couple of the students got together and put a tent up in the middle of the library. I mean, so these are the last few socialists left that ever went to law school. They put a tent up because we were going to do this protest and keep it manned. We didn't keep it manned very long. I think we lasted 2 days, and then we had to take it down. And then we just sort of succumbed to these new rules, which was really sad. I think we should have stuck this out longer because everyone would have reaped the benefits that we've been able to talk them into longer hours. And I don't care how messy it is, you should have coffee at your carols. And the third year should be allowed to camp out. And that's just the way it should be. And I guess we kind of didn't do our part, guys, because that's how it's been ever since.
And students still complain about the library hours. So
Yeah.
I would say I agree with you there. Besides that move, what else interesting happened when you were in law school dealing with, the law school itself?
My experiences were usually very singular and different from the class because I was working.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really looked down upon by the professors. It was a problem. And so we spent, those of us that were working outside and clerking, spent a lot of our time not just clerking but trying to hide it from our professors. I told you that I was sort of involved in fraud and lying at a very early age in my law school career. But my very first year of law school, I applied for a job that was open only to second and third year students. And I went to this lawyer and lied to him and told him that I was a second year student. And he wasn't an idiot. And he could just tell by looking at me, this woman doesn't know anything. And I said, no. He goes, well, have you had property? Sure I have. Of course I hadn't had property. Had you had evidence? Oh yeah, sure I have. Hadn't taken evidence. That was for the following year. And I said, look, why don't you just give me a project, let me work on it. If you like the work, you've got a law clerk. If you don't like the work, well, you got a little free research and you can talk to somebody else. He said, but you've got nothing to lose. Fine. So it gives me this huge project on real estate. And so I know nothing, absolutely nothing. And I must have put, 30 hours into this project. It would have taken anyone else maybe 8 hours, or maybe even less than that. So I handed him this project, and he said, how long did it take you? And I said, 5 hours. And he looked at me and read it. He called me up and he said, okay, you've got a job. So now I was stuck doing these projects for the rest of my career. It would take me like 30 or 40 hours, and I had to keep telling him, it only took me 6 hours. It only took me 7 hours. But that was most of what I was doing in my spare time. Mm-hmm. So in terms of a lot of interacting, I think there were a lot. Let me take that back. There weren't a lot doing that. There was the huge majority of the class were students here that, whatever their source of finances, were able to go to school and not do anything else, which is the way you would like to do it. But there was a small group of us that had to work, we were working, and spent a lot of time doing that. And it clashed with our ability to attend classes, it clashed with our ability to study, but it was just something that we had to do. So that was the small crew that I was more aware of, because we would do a lot of commiserating, hanging out together, help each other out if you got into a bind with something being due here and a project due downtown. And the rest of the crew, I really wasn't that aware of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Outside the law school, what was going on with the world at that time?
Well, there was a lot going on. President Reagan was shot. There was, in fact, I was in Washington, D.C. when I got out of law school. My first job was working for Mo Udall as a staff attorney, and the trial was going on, the Hinckley trial, so I got to watch a lot of that. It was the late 70s. There was a lot of change going on. There was that change not only in the way we perceived ourselves as like the last liberal class, and not even that. We saw ourselves as the last few liberals in a law school class. But that was the way the world really was changing too. The 70s, while they certainly don't have as much of a claim to fame as what was going on in the 60s, there was a lot going on in terms of still caring about what was going on and looking outward. In the 80s, I think everyone will admit, everybody started looking inward. And our law school class was a mirror of that. And everything that we saw going on around us, it just reinforced that. Things really, really changed. In 1881, when we graduated, it was a very different world than it was when we entered our law school class.
Mhm. I have a couple law school-like questions for
Okay.
you later. Judge Bernini, if you were to change one thing about legal education, what would it be?
I would institute a residency immediately. We have no idea what we're doing when we get out of law school. I had someone ask me, what does a 25 or 26-year-old brand new lawyer know? And I go, nothing. You know, would you entrust someone like that with your legal problems? No. And yet here we are, you finished 7 years minimum of schooling. You're anxious to get out, your school loans are due, you have to get a job. And other than going into a large firm where you just sort of get absorbed and you do small projects until they decide 15 years later that they're going to let you actually walk into a courtroom, what are you supposed to do? And unfortunately, the choice for a lot of us is to go into private practice, set up shop. May not be the majority of the students coming out and graduating and passing the bar, but the fact that any of them are doing it is frightening. And it's as frightening to them. We're not prepared. And what law school teaches us is just a different way of approaching a problem. That's all law school really does. It's not really substantive education. All it does is teach us a different way to approach problems and changes us for the rest of our life, in addition to probably robbing us of most of our sense of humor. But other than that, law school is almost a finishing school, which is why I said that the people coming through my law school class who had other lives and careers did the best. Because what they were doing was layering on this law school way of looking at the world and the way of looking at problems and trying to solve them on top of life experience. So if we could do a residency the way they do in the med school and give people a chance to work with a lawyer, under a lawyer, and then the public would know this person did a residency in this area. Not only are we giving them the real education that they need to be able to go out and foist themselves on the public and ask for money in exchange, but we're doing a service to the community at large. We're doing a service to the young lawyers. They're getting the education that now they really need to go with what we get here now in our 3 years to actually be good lawyers. And that's the change that I have for a long time wished could be instituted. Again, it would drag out maybe the number of years, but when you look at what you don't know when you get out, I think a lot of people would probably benefit by it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent idea, and I've heard it from various people at the law school as well, so maybe someday in our lifetime it will happen. What would you say would be a defining characteristic of the University of Arizona College of Law?
Now or then?
Both.
Well, now you have me stumped because I can define the characteristic of the people, or I could define the characteristic of the school itself. And while those should be matching, they're not necessarily are. Our class was just starting to become totally self-absorbed. And that's not something that I'm so sure changed as they got older and kind of grew into their careers. The students I see now, because I teach here, there's a mix. There's the incredibly self-absorbed, but I'm starting to see these fresh minds again that I saw a long, long time ago, and that's very, very reassuring. I mean, I still have people come up to me and say, you know, wow, I've got this job offer, and I'm going to make $92,000 a year my very first year out. And I said, have you thought what the trade-off is? I said, that's terrific, and that may be what you want, but have you thought of the trade-off? What are you talking about? And I'll go into, you know, the number of hours they're going to expect as a commitment, what that means. And they'll look at me and go, are you nuts? It's $92,000 a year. All right, that's fine. I have people come up to me and go, I want to be a judge. What do I need to do to become a judge? And I go, well, get a life. Then you need to practice law. I mean, you need to do some things first. I find it amazing that you could still be in law school and your goal right then is, I'm going to be a judge without having experienced what law is to see if you even like it. Because if you want to be a judge, you had better love the law. And I'm not sure that some of these people do. The law school itself, back when I was attending the law school, the way I would describe it was just distant. I didn't see it as very involved in terms of caring what the output was. I think that people cared in their individual classes, but I didn't see any connection or anyone putting that much effort, except there were a few, and we mentioned them, but caring about what this meant when this class was out and practicing law, what that meant for the reputation of the school. It just wasn't where people's focus was. Here they care, maybe they care too much, but boy, do they care. It's a very different place when I walk into the College of Law now. And that's apart from the fancy name change. Before you guys even did that, there seems to be a real concern about what these people are going to mean to the public and to the community at large and what we're putting out there. And there's a lot of concern there. So I don't want to call them compassionate. That sounds too soft and silly. But I think there's more of a concern, more of an involvement now. The law school itself just is involved, and I think that's a good thing.
With the profession and the community.
Absolutely.
Good. That's what we're trying to do that. If you were to convey a message to future law students, what would it be?
Don't be afraid to have a tan when you study for the bar exam. It's important that you study, but it's not as bad as people are going to make it sound. And if you actually attended class and you still maintained your logic, you're going to be able to get through the exam. It's not that bad. I guess the other thing that I wish people would realize is that being a lawyer carries a lot more responsibility with it than probably any other profession that you could get involved in. It's a profession that has had declining respect over the years, and this is a chance for us to get it back. And I think that this is the class that's going to be able to start making that change. So get a tan, smile through your bar exam, but go out there and change things. You have to be able to do that, and I think they can.
Good. What would you like to see the law school accomplish in the future?
I would like to see them make some changes where the professors realize how important the clinical programs are. You have a lot of clinical programs now, things that weren't available back then. But I wish that there was a mesh where everyone understood how important the two are, that they need to work together. If we can't go to an all-out residency, I wish that there was almost a funneling, like we're going to talk about how to approach these problems, but then here's a place where you can go and practice it, instead of this feeling that practicing at law school will somehow ruin you forever and that you can't actually learn that way. I think that's a better way to go. I'd certainly love for the law school to keep its rankings. It's for me to tell people now that I went to the University of Arizona College of Law, well, now I have to remember the James E. Rogers College of Law so that they know what I'm talking about. And they're like, oh, and they've heard of it. I mean, when I told them where I went before, it was like, oh, I couldn't get into a real law school. And, so I certainly wanted to keep their rankings because, boy, has that done a lot for the prestige that I feel. And I would like them to continue to turn out people who, not everyone, you can't control what people want to do with their lives, but I would really like the school to continue to turn out that small group of people that when they get together at reunion time can sit around and talk about what they've done and what they've accomplished and the good they feel they've done being a lawyer after having graduated from this school. And I think they can do that too.
Good. Is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about?
No, I think I probably talked way too much.
Talked a perfect amount of time. Thank you very much,
Sure.
Deborah Bernini.